I want to bring in CNN military analyst and retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel, thank you so much for joining us at this hour. What would Western supplied planes mean to Ukraine and its ability to push Russia back?
Well, between planes and helicopters, Sarah, you'd have quite a good mix for the Ukrainians to actually go after the Russians, not only on the front lines, but behind the front lines. So this is, I think, one of the key factors that the Ukrainians are still looking for, one of the key factors that's also missing from any type of modern military operation. Either side has been able to declare air supremacy over Ukraine or even air superiority over Ukraine. And if the Ukrainians were able to get air superiority, even in localized areas, that would be a huge deal for them. Now, one of the big questions, of course, is how well and how quickly can they be trained to use different equipment? What Sam showed, with the Mi-8 helicopters, that's, about 2 generations ago in terms of helicopters and aviation. If they're going to be brought up to speed, that's going to be a different situation, and it's going to take some time to do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of technology that has been majorly updated and a lot of things to learn. Next week, and I cannot believe this, but it marks the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. I remember at the time when it first happened that the U.S. intelligence at the time had said that probably Russia was going to take the capital, Kyiv, in 3 days. That clearly did not happen. And of course, since then, there have been rethinks about all of this, especially on Russia's side. Did you think that the war would be where it is today, not knowing what you know now?
Yeah, hindsight, of course, is always 20/20, right, Sarah? But I think the big takeaway here is that the Ukrainians confounded most expectations, whether on the Russian side or on the Ukrainian side even, and certainly on the Western side. I think a lot of people expected a repeat of 1968 when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact invaded what was then Czechoslovakia, and to get rid of that relatively liberal communist regime at that point. But Ukraine's quite different, and Ukraine had tasted freedom. They knew that they had to fight in order to survive, and that very fact, I think, surprised many of us. And I think that's the key thing. It's quite a surprise that they did this. But now that we're at this point, the Ukrainians need a lot more in terms of weapons, in terms of ammunition, and in terms of the ability to move forward to actually regain the territory that they've lost. They've done a major job in recapturing a lot of territory up to this point, but they haven't quite got what they want in order to achieve that stalemate that they're looking for.
Yeah, there's still some horrible, bloody battles that continue to take civilians' lives. One of the things about being on the ground there, from my perspective, is there were a few things that really changed the tenor and tone of this. One of them was Zelensky, him staying in place, him fighting back himself, and not just putting his countrymen on the front line. And the other is that the Ukrainian people aren't having it. Like, you're talking about grandmothers to grandbabies. Like, they are not going to let this end with Russia taking over their country. The U.S., though, has been warning its allies that China may increase its military support of Ukraine. And what that would mean, I would like to hear from you what you think that would mean if China decides to start supplying Russia with whatever it may need, although everyone thought that Russia's forces were stronger than Ukraine's. But what would that mean going forward for Ukraine?
Yeah, it certainly would cause some problems for Ukraine. I think one of the key things to think about here is the huge disparity in terms of numbers between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russians, before the war, had about 10 times the defense budget of the Ukrainians, and that was also reflected in personnel numbers. But what we've learned since then is that the quantitative ability of the Russians and the quantitative preponderance of the Russians is really not a match for the Ukrainians as long as the Ukrainians get the weapons that they need from the West. So the Chinese, if they support the Russians, in a major way, that is going to put a strain on the Ukrainians. It's also going to put a strain on NATO, and NATO is going to have to step up its game. The defense industrial base is going to have to play a huge part in resupplying the Ukrainians, and it's going to have to do so very, very quickly. We have to expect the Chinese to do this, and we have to act accordingly.
Well, this is an unprovoked war from the auspices of Ukraine's side. Russia invaded for no apparent reason other than wanting to take territory, and so we will see what happens in the end. But I know that the Ukrainians are going to be fighting awfully hard to keep that from happening. Colonel Cedric Leighton, thank you so much for your insight.
You bet, Sarah. Anytime.